I played around this old town too long. Summer's almost gone and winter's coming on. I laid around, I played around this old town too long, and I feel like I got travel on. Papa writes to Johnny, Johnny can't come home. Johnny can't come home, and Johnny can't come home. Papa writes to Johnny, Johnny can't come home. He's been on a chain gang too long. Summer's almost gone and winter's coming on. I played around this whole town too long, and I feel like I got travel on. I want to see my honey, I want to see her back.
Okay, folks, if we could get seated, please. No, don't worry about it. All right, guys, if we could find seats, we need to get started. Okay, welcome back. Welcome back to the little people. Okay, if folks could come all the way in. Okay, we're going to start. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Peter Armstrong.
Go? All right. So, hi. Everybody hear me okay? Or should I use the mic? Mic? All right. Hey. So my name is Peter Armstrong. I'm here today to talk about Lean Publishing lessons learned at Leanpub. I'm co-founder of Leanpub. Yeah, that's my contact info. So I have 20 minutes. I have 218 slides, and I'm going to answer, or try to ask, and hopefully have some answers for 5 questions. What's Lean Publishing? What's Leanpub? What are the historical origins of Lean Publishing? Excuse me. What has Leanpub learned about Lean Publishing, and how could Lean Publishing evolve? So first of all, what's Lean Publishing? So it's an attempt to solve the following problems, which are shared by authors and publishers. Excuse me. Will anybody care? How will people find out about the book? When will the book be done? And will it be released while it's still relevant? How should we price the book? How should we produce ebooks that look good on all ebook readers? And how do we do all this and still produce a great looking print book? Should we even make a print book? And do we really need to use Word? Really? So that's the sort of informal introduction. Now the sort of formal definition of lean publishing. So lean publishing So first of all, the notion of publishing an in-progress book. Why would you want to do that? It sounds crazy, right? So the thing that led me to this idea was the realization that a book is a startup in many ways. I said this in 2010, and I'm going to repeat it again. A book is a startup. It's a risky, highly creative endeavor undertaken by a small team with a low probability of success. And at its core, with both books and startups, it's very easy to create something nobody wants, right? But startups are hard, right? Books are hard. That's inevitable. That's state of the art, right? So in Silicon Valley, in the last 10 years, people started to change their minds about this, starting with Steve Blank, who had the idea of, hey, if you want to build something for customers, it makes sense to talk to them. This was a revolutionary idea. And he published this in a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And then this young guy met him and wanted money, and he said, take my class, and that guy did, and he was Eric Ries. And he came up with the idea of lean startup, which is basically customer development and get out of the building applied to the idea of building web startups. And Eric Ries is the famous best-selling author of not the book on the right, which was published on Leanpub, but the book on the left, which was the follow-on, New York Times best-selling lean startup. So that's the idea of publishing an in-progress book, is it goes to the idea of lean startups. Now, the notion of lightweight tools, which is the next part of the definition. So when you think about lightweight tools, why is this important? The simple reason is if your tools are heavy, you won't publish enough. If you have friction in publishing, you will not iterate, right? And so if you want to iterate and get your work out there and build an authentic community around your work, you need to have the process as lightweight as possible. And so that's why we went and built Leanpub, which is basically lean publishing as a service. Now the next aspect of the definition, many iterations. So this goes to open source software. So I don't have to explain open source software at the Internet Archive, thankfully. But someone named Eric Raymond wrote a thing called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, talking about the idea of release early, release often, right? And so in publishing, the similar idea is publish early, publish often, and listen to your readers, to get reader feedback. Now, in publishing, traditionally, development editors have functioned as a proxy for readers. Well, you know who else does a good job of that? Readers, right? Now this is true for technical books, it's also true for business books and serial fiction. Now the next idea is pivoting until you have the right book. So Eric Ries came up with this notion of pivot, and basically the idea of, it's like the idea about with startups and something is if you're building something, it's not just you get your course exactly right and just go. It's more like paddling a canoe, making sort of constant adjustments. Similarly, writing a book, authors have done this, from time immemorial, getting feedback from other authors, having writers' circles, et cetera. And this just basically brings that notion into the internet age where you can actually engage with people you've never even met, by just releasing your book as it's in progress. Now the next idea about the right book, this goes to the idea of product market fit. And so Mark Andreessen came up with this notion of product market fit. There's a great quote about it that I won't read exactly, but the idea is when you can feel product market fit happening, basically people are buying as fast as they can, and most startups fail because they don't ever get there. And the same idea applies to books, which is that if your book isn't right, then no amount of marketing is going to help it, right? So that's the reason why you want to publish in progress is to get feedback from readers and change the thing you're building so that it addresses, so that it's better and improvement. And then once you've done that, then you build traction with things like Twitter, Facebook, blogs, et cetera. Now, that's what publishers should be focused on improving. So just to recap, lean publishing is the idea of publishing an in-progress book using lightweight tools and many iterations to get reader feedback, pivot until you have the right book, and build traction once you do. So that's lean publishing. Now what's Leanpub? So we're this simple, free ebook workflow, and we're funded by an optional store. So we make ebooks that are kind of the ebook version of don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. So our books are the ebook versions of books that a reader from 100 years ago would recognize as a book. They're not apps. They have no ads, no JavaScript, no tracking, no DRM. We're strictly opt-in for things like reader email addresses because we're very focused on privacy. So what is a Leanpub book? Words. Sometimes they have images. This is high tech. Sometimes even a few tables. We had to actually use a markdown extension for that. No external resources, no videos, nothing fancy. And this optional storefront that sells them. So we launched a few years ago, and when we launched, we were completely at zero, which was depressing, and then started growing some more. So now in the last 30 days, authors have made $85,000 in royalties on Leanpub. So we're happy that we're helping, we're kind of like Kickstarter in that way, in that we help we help fund things that aren't done yet and help the creative process. Most of our books that are doing well are computer programming books, but we also have fiction, serial fiction, other nonfiction. Authors can bundle things together. They can have nice, attractive landing pages, and people can buy them and choose what they like. They can choose. They actually voluntarily pay more than the minimum price. But the interesting thing that I want to talk about today is the idea of lean publishing is the workflow. So you write in plain text in Markdown. Because I have essays I wrote in university in some old version of Word. I have no idea if I could ever open them anymore, right? You should produce your content and your work in something that has a chance of being readable 20, 30 years from now. And plain text is what we think plain text, either on people's computers or on Leanpub website. If you're writing on your own computer, we sync with Dropbox. You write in a little folder, then you click a button, and then a book exists. And if you click a different button, it's for sale, and you can even write in the website if you feel like doing that. So, historical origins of lean publishing. I'm not going to talk about 10 years ago historical origins. I'm going to go way back to Victorian England. So, serial fiction was first popularized in Victorian England by Charles Dickens, who was a publishing revolutionary. His first book, Sketches by Boz, he was 21 only. It was in monthly serial, and it was published 1833 to 1836, nonfiction and fiction. But this really kicked off with the Pickwick Papers. So he was 24 years old. It was a monthly serial. And it started as this idea by this illustrator, Robert Seymour, for a series of sketches about some hunters and fishermen. And he had this idea. He was a drawer. He wanted to publish some sketches. People like looking at pictures. So proposed the idea. All you needed was a writer to fill some text in. You writing? Sure, I'll do it. But I don't know much about hunting and fishing. So how about I write my own stuff? And we changed the drawings to match my writing. You like Sketches by Boz, right? And let's call it the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club, containing a faithful record of the perambulations, perils, travels, and adventures of sporting transactions of the corresponding members. So that didn't go over too well. And one day, Robert Seymour and Charles Dickens had a drunken argument. Next day, Robert Seymour completed this illustration for the Pickwick Papers entitled The Dying Clown. Now, it was at chapter 2 at that point, and it was going badly. Dickens persisted, and in chapter 10 invented this humorous character, Sam Weller. And people loved him. Pickwick Papers took off. First installment, 400 copies sold only of the first chapter. By the end, 40,000 copies sold of the installment. And remember, this is Victorian England. There were fewer people back then, so it's more impressive, because percentage-wise. Dickens published all his novels in serial, except the Christmas books. For example, Oliver Twist, you might have heard of it, monthly serial. Nicholas Nickleby, monthly serial. Old Curiosity Shop, monthly serial. Some others, I don't know, like Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. These were all serials, weekly or monthly. The Pickwick Papers established serial fiction as the way fiction should be first published in the 1800s. Books split into volumes where successful serials were reprinted once completed. And that's the serials how you built traction for the book. Finished book was just something, an extra way to monetize things afterward. And Dickens preferred to publish in serial, getting reader feedback and using cliffhangers to build buzz. Crowds in New York, is Little Nell dead? Trying to find out what happened next, right? It's the equivalent of watching something serialized today, like Mad Men, or if you're everybody, Breaking Bad finale just happened, right? Everybody's all excited about that. Finding out what's going to happen next. This is the equivalent. Now, interestingly, Dickens didn't just write serial fiction. He also published it. He was half owner, full editor of something called Household Words for 10 years. And then he had this idea that, if I'm doing all the stuff, shouldn't I just own everything? So he started something else called All the Year Round, founded, owned, and edited by Charles Dickens. So I didn't know this, right? Dickens was an entrepreneur. If he was around today, he'd be in TechCrunch and Huffington Post, be like, oh, Charles Dickens started this new thing. Oh, is it going to be public? And he's raised $2 million from the local angels. And, Tale of Two Cities. In All the Year Round, you have things like Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations, also works by Wilkie Collins, Women in White, No Name, The Moonstone. And Wilkie Collins was this interesting character. First detective novel, The Moonstone, published as serial fiction. Women in White, first sensation novel, serial fiction. And it led to the sensation novels of the 1860s, whose star author was Mary Elizabeth Braddon. So her fourth novel, but first one that actually took off, was Lady Audley's Secret, published as a weekly serial. And it was directly descended of The Women in White. Manipulation, bigamy, murder, arson, insanity. Who said Victorian England was boring? It was published extremely early and often. She was living with this publisher, John Maxwell, no relation to that John Maxwell, and he had 5 kids and a wife in an insane asylum in Ireland, and he was launching a magazine. And just before it launched, lead serial didn't show up. No one here has ever missed the deadline, right? I can write the lead serial, but even if you were strong enough to fill the position, there is no time. Direct quote. I'm sure that went over well. Installment were on my breakfast table. Tomorrow morning it would be in time. Good luck, right? Next morning, he found the opening chapters on his breakfast table, launched the magazine with it, and the magazine died. This would be a bad thing. You'd expect it to have problems for the book. But, people were interested because they were hooked, and people encouraged her to keep writing. Serialization resumed, hand to mouth as a serial. Now, the interesting thing about this was essentially the 50 Shades of Grey of the 1860s. Mary Braddon was very prolific. She completed over 80 novels, and also some anonymous ones she wrote in down market things like Penny Dreadfuls, Penny Bloods, etc. In the 1860s, 2 or 3 novels per year, published as serial. And she also had 6 kids, and she was editing a magazine and doing other things. When you think nowadays, though, the interesting thing is literary fiction, things that people get all snobby about today, is essentially a reaction against the massive popularity of sensation fiction. And it's the direct descendant genre fiction. So I was just at a conference in Brisbane of genre fiction authors, and it was really interesting because genre fiction authors are like romance novelists, like crime, et cetera, are essentially used to being looked down upon by the sort of more literary types. But the people who do that don't even realize why they're doing it, is that it's this sort of 150-year backlash against the popularity in Victorian England of serials, sensation fiction, and all that. But there's an interesting thing about the notion of, if you're going to do drama, you actually, we cannot afford to forget that the first and not one of the least difficult requirements of either prose or verse is that it should be interesting, right? The sort of backlash against all plot, all drama, all excitement of sensation fiction has sort of spawned this notion of literary fiction. Now, in the 1800s, serial fiction just wasn't just for sensation fiction. Literary fiction also was done that way. Brothers Karamazov, Russian Messenger, War and Peace, Russian Messenger, well, part of it. Anna Karenina, Russian Messenger. And serial publishing was also used for fiction that was focused on social change. So Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in an abolitionist newspaper in the National Era. And she was approached by a publisher to publish it in book form. Did okay. Millions were sold and pirated. Best-selling novel of the 1800s. Number 2 book in the US behind the Bible. Prominent abolitionist event. So let's skip forward a bit to recent history. We'll talk about fan fiction. So most fan fiction is serial fiction. And there's so much fan fiction that it essentially looks like this. Like, serial fan fiction is what fan fiction really is. And if you think about circling back to 50 Shades of Grey, the interesting thing about that is it started as fan fiction, right? Called Master of the Universe by Snow Queen's Ice Dragon, greatest pen name ever. Now, why would you do this? So this isn't the number of hits or the number of readers. This is the number of unique pieces of fan fiction. For Harry Potter and Twilight a few months ago, This is like 200,000, right? Unique bits of work like created in the Twilight universe, over 600,000 in the Harry Potter universe. So that's demand. So fanfiction.net, if you're doing fanfiction, that's where you want to write and produce your stuff because it's a great way for getting reader feedback and a community around your book. Now that's where 50 Shades started as Master of the Universe. Then it went on its own website, and then she rewrote it, or the parts of it, enough of it, to publish it as 50 Shades of Grey, and even more success followed. And it was number 1, 2, 3, and 4 on Amazon. And the interesting thing, though, is this is what advanced buzz from serial fiction can do. 3 books published best-selling, first published in serial, wrote very quickly, hated by critics, despised, because they're fantastically wealthy women. So, okay, so what's Leanpub learned about lean publishing? First of all, the thing we've learned, which is mostly interesting to us, is it's a no-brainer for computer programming books. Basically, for us, we want books that are written by opinionated entrepreneurial authors to be published on Leanpub. The more general thing is that everyone is optional. Like everybody in the publishing industry, we're all optional, right? Writers are necessary, readers are necessary, everyone else, I mean, there's no gatekeepers anymore. We all need to earn our place at the table, and the way we have to do that is by creating more value than we take. Like for example, with Leanpub, if we don't do that, then people will just publish on Gumroad, like on any arbitrary digital goods store that could just lots of other lessons, but no time. So last one, how could lean publishing evolve? So first of all, for me, I think the most interesting thing is the return of serial fiction. So sites like Wattpad, who's heard of Wattpad? Awesome, cool. So yeah, so Wattpad's doing really well. It's like essentially like similar to fanfiction.net, but just for normal fiction. Fanfiction.net, blogs, Leanpub, Amazon KDP. Basically, for us, fiction authors should, if you're not known and you want to build some sort of community around your work, you should use something that lets you publish in serial, build an audience, and then transition to selling once you actually have an audience or you're done your book. And that's why we can import from Wattpad to WordPress and Blogger. But the bigger point is, as an author, you need to market yourself. Right? And this is true regardless of whether you do a deal with a publisher. If you do a deal with a publisher, what's the next thing they're going to say? Get on Twitter, blog about your book, right? Now, but the possibilities we have now are endless. Imagine if the last Harry Potter book had been published 1 chapter at a time in a globally distributed magazine, or in an ebook store, or in an app store. J.K. Rowling could have bought Canada. Thanks.
Sound? Do you need sound?
No. Sorry. Okay, yeah. For those who don't know me, I'm Baldur Bjarnason. I've long time sort of opinionator online on anything regarding ebooks. I'm working currently for Unbound as part of their digital production team. And like many of you, my first experience with creating interactive media was HyperCard. I mean, so many of us had our first sort of focus our creative energies and how we create these works. And that is by focusing on the experience that we're creating for the audience. As in, when it comes to interactive media, interactivity is what you do. It's not what you watch. It's not what you hear, not what you read. The text in a piece of interactive media, that's not, that's not the work. And to be more specific, interactive media is composed of the meaningful actions that the user takes while interacting with the work. The stuff that you see on the screen, that's a product, which is an important thing. But it doesn't actually become anything until it is experienced by the audience. And in terms of interactive media, that experience is their actions. And I'm completely agnostic about the idea of whether they're, interactive media is a hypercard stack or an ebook or an app or a website. You can think of this as like duck typing. If it quacks like interactive media, walks like interactive media, and flies like interactive media, it probably is interactive media. Format be damned. And you're probably familiar with this idea, because this is basically what Marish and McLuhan meant with this, is that the experience of the work is what is the work itself. There's no big and to be more specific, he actually nicked the idea from John Dewey, who was writing in 1931. And the basic idea is the audience has no way of reading our minds and knowing what our message was or the subject matter was. So their entire experience of what we want to convey to them is mediated through the structure and the form of the interactive media. So we have to think about the work as the experience that the user has when they're engaging with the work, and not as the piece of metal or the pixels that you see on the screen. Breaking it down a little bit further into the bits. The first obvious thing that you see in interactive media are the objects and widgets on the screen, the bits that you interact with. And the important thing to think about there is that it's objects all the way down. Almost every interactive thing that you interact with is composed of other bits that you interact with as well. A dialog box is made out of a series of buttons. The button is made out of a series of states that each responds to your actions, and it's a loosely connected structure because it's not tightly connected like a novel is, where everything happens one after another. It's you can't necessarily predict exactly how the relationships between all of the interactive bits will play out. The second thing to think about is context. The best example of why this is important came from a game designer called, I think I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Rafe Koster. His example was about two different games. One is Tetris, the one that we all know and love, about stacking bricks and making them disappear. But he posited an idea where you could have another game that has exactly the same gameplay, exactly the same design, the same interaction, same everything, except by virtue of the design context around it, you're playing a Nazi trying to stack bodies or corpses in a pit and trying to maximize the amount of dead people you can get into a pit. And that changes the game that's otherwise identical into something horrifying, just by virtue of context. You haven't changed any of the actions, you haven't changed anything that anybody does. You just by virtue of the context, you've completely colored the entire experience. And the sort of third major bit is, obviously, any piece of interactivity requires direct feedback, because otherwise you won't know that you've clicked a button. Otherwise, you won't know that you've paged through something or interacted with something. But notifications or prompts is something that you can so basically feedback is something you can actually disconnect from the direct action and use it to space out the structure in time or space, depending if you want to with GPS and smartphones. And the final major bit is play. This definition, play being free movement within a more rigid structure, it plays with the other meaning of play, being a little bit of flex. And it comes from I stole it from the Rules of Play by Kate Salin and Eric Zimmerman. And the basic idea there is that a non-playful slider would be a slider where you can basically slam it to each end and get the minimum and maximum values. A playful slider would let you go above or beyond and give you direct feedback about how far off or how distant, by how much you missed. And if you wanted to make it a game, then you'd start letting the user collect points based on how often they actually managed to hit. So the point about play is that every single bit of interactive media that you create can either be playful or not. It doesn't have to be a game, or it doesn't have to be, you can turn any piece of interaction into a playful experience just by adding a little bit of flex around it and giving people feedback depending on how closely or not closely they hit it. But there are pitfalls, major pitfalls. This is something these are pitfalls that a lot of people in publishing run into. And this is kind of the biggest one, is that you can't make something that isn't interactive. You can't take a novel and just glob on interactive bits onto it, because the novel it is a completely linear structure. It doesn't have the structure that allows for interactive to be integrated within the experience. It would be two separate experiences joined at the hip. A piece of interactive media is something that's composed of actions, of meaningful actions that have an effect on the experience. It's not decorated, a decorated piece of other kind of media. And this is the thing that annoys me greatly. When perspective didn't appear in painting because some mathematician invented the idea of, I've got this mechanism and concept for creating perspective in painting, but I've never painted before. I'm going to have this invention that I'm going to go around and sell to painters that, you've got this is a method that you can now use to create perspective in painting. Perspective came from a demand for experience, for a new experience. It was painters that wanted to represent their ideals, their needs for new experiences and new art. And so it was painters that learned mathematics. And it was painters that experimented with mirrors and trying to build new techniques. And the point is, techniques do not appear in isolation from the creative process. And this is why iBooks Author, for example, is an atrocious idea for creating interactive works. It is literally paint by numbers for interactivity. You are asking your designer to fill in boxes created by a programmer somewhere out in the probably somewhere here in San Francisco, and you are abandoning a large part of the authorship of your work. And that's why the programmer is your co-author. He needs to be treated as such because they have such a control over the experience of the interactive media work that they affect the work more than a cover designer, more than an illustrator, more than a typesetter, more than a designer. Leaving them out, outsourcing it, or even worse, standardizing it in the form of apps that are used to author some, pre-built blocks of interactivity, it means that you're abandoning a large part of the authorship of the work and your control. It means that you're just going to end up with cookie cutter media artifacts. And another big pitfall is the tragedy of design fads. The issue with skeuomorphism versus flat is that it's about ornamentation. It's not about functionality. The biggest tragedy about iBooks, copying the book metaphor in its design, isn't that it copied the book metaphor, it's that it was non-functional. If design, because well, a big problem with the flat trend is that it assumes expertise. It assumes that you know that the thing that's in the upper left-hand corner of the screen is something you can click on or press. When nobody's born, nobody pops out of the womb with an ingrained knowledge of how interaction works or user interfaces work. And if everything goes to flat design, where are the how are the new users going to learn the basics of interactive media? It's pox on both their houses. And the final pitfall is from the perspective of the user, all of their experiences are linear. I mean, we are linear beings. We experience things in time, but it is not necessarily something that has an end, because it's like when we experience painting. There's a point where we start watching or inspecting the painting. There's a point where we stop. Instead of thinking about it, it's not really an end, it's a suspension, because we can always revisit it. And every time we revisit it, it will be a different experience. The same thing applies to interactive media. It's not, strictly speaking, a linear sort of artifact like a novel or a book would be, but it has a linear experience to it, and it has but it's the end bit that gets people the most. Realizing that people can actually leave the work and revisit at a later stage, or even not. And now I think we should move on to the more concrete examples. Instead of the sort of abstract theory that sort of everybody's nodding off to. This is one of the sort of more interesting works I've seen lately. Made by friends of mine, Tom and Duncan Speakman. It's a part of a UK research project called REACT that's supposed to promote collaboration between artists, academics, and industry. And they had a few helpers on it called Nick Harkaway and Neil Gaiman. Don't know if you know them. And the idea there is that the work was split in two. One of them was a gloriously designed printed book that was an incomplete experience. There was no way to make sense of the printed book without the interactive bits. And the interactive bits were spread out over the center of Bristol in Wi-Fi hotspots. So to experience the whole work, you had to wander around the center of Bristol with a smartphone in one hand, a book in the other hand, and you had to sort of plug the two things together to make sense. The text had cues for what you should do with the book. And the story was about an alternate Bristol that surfaced on sort of every few years that was different from ours. And the text was sort of messages from the other side. And you were trying to the idea was that we were trying to explore and discover what this other Bristol was from the perspective of ours. And the what an important part of what they did is that everything was a little bit playful. Especially the text responded to your touch. It was sort of, as soon as you tried to read the text, you'd realize that this is behaving like normal text. Some of it moves, some of it disappears once you react to it, so it actually can be acted on. It's a bit academic, and it had a few issues, and it was a bit difficult to use, but it actually made money because people like buying things that have souvenirs. So the idea of mixing creating an interactive experience that was a mix of print and digital was something that clearly, people were more willing to pay for the book and sort of having a souvenir for it than you would they are for many apps. And also, I think the sort of exclusivity was appealed to a lot of people because it was like a fixed time event, and when they're planning doing it again in other cities, and each city will be different because it needs to be adjusted and rewritten to fit each location. So even though this is not purely digital, this is purely interactive media. So that's part of the reason why at the start I said, I'm a bit agnostic about sort of everything I was talking about earlier in terms of spacing things out in time, it's not just a single object, it's composed of dialog boxes, app-like things, or down to just audio media. And you can see that you have access to his Dropbox as well. So you can access the secret government files where he's plotting to cover things up. Overall, it's one of my favorites. Here's the point of it. This entire thing is hard. The makers of the Malcolm Tucker Thick of It app, they closed this just about a month ago after a lengthy analysis and thought where he talked about where Dave Addy, who ran Ajax, he basically outlined that this isn't sustainable. Creating apps that are this involved and complex and selling them like titles, like we do with ebooks or print books, just doesn't work. People aren't willing to pay enough money for it to work, and they don't. Even when you lower the price, they don't buy it in enough volume for it to work. So, beyond just the financial logistics of it, it's also incredibly hard just in creative terms, because it involves a lot of control for both the creator and for the audience. A novelist has perfect control over the pacing of one sentence or chapter to the other in terms of a linear structure. And the reader has perfect control over how quickly they read through that fixed text. But in interactive media, the author loses control over how sort of spaced out and how interrelated the objects are, because they are composed of non-fixed and fluid things. And the reader as well loses control over the timing, because there can be prompts, there can be notifications, there can be things spread out over time. So that was basically the end. This is the final slide, by the way. So yeah, I think that's sort of good.
Hello. All right, I'm introducing myself. Hello, I'm James. I'm from London. I know quite a few of you, actually. It's lovely to be back here again. It's been a couple of years. I originally prepared this talk to give at the Creating Minds conference at Berkeley yesterday, and I did give it there. But Peter kindly and generously asked me to give it again here. So it's not quite like some of the other talks, possibly. It's largely me rambling on about what I reckon about forms of literature and about the internet and about networks. And I'm just going to talk about that for a bit. Lots of these kind of conferences and bookie events, we always play what I call Gutenberg bingo, which is a competition to see who first can mention Gutenberg or Victorian serial fiction or any of those. So I'm going to, I don't know if I've won, I might have missed some earlier, and someone will probably go back further, but I'm going to go back a bit in a second. But I'm going to start here. This is Gurgaon, a new city on the edge of Delhi. What happens here is that books go to become digital. As many of you in this room, I'm sure, know, there's kind of a bunch of processes you can go through to take a physical book and make it digital. This is one of them, but it's the kind of industrial scale stuff. Gurgaon and in various other places in India, like sort of Bangalore and Noida, and until events the last couple of years, quite a few places in North Africa were kind of centers of book digitization. And what that means is when publishers have a huge stack of paper books, then they'll box them up and they'll ship them off to somewhere like this, where in a very brutal process, they'll be transformed into digital files. That is literally a brutal process. The spines are chopped from the books, and the pages are individually fed through a big sheet scanner. This isn't your nice kind of gentle library process. This is the industrial version. And various ways go from that. So you can just scan the books and you can turn them into images and output them just as a PDF, or you can OCR them and you get a nicely more readable, searchable text. Or at the kind of extreme level, the most advanced level, you do double keying, which is when two people sit down and they both type the book up, and then you run a diff on them, and you get basically, that's pretty much the most accurate by that process. And we've seen this process happen before. Of several hundred years, the literary remnants of kind of classical civilization in Europe survived the Middle Ages by passing through the Arab world, where they were transcribed and commented upon and reproduced and retranscribed by Arabic scholars in places like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, which in the middle of the 9th century under the Abbasids was the largest repository of books in the world. Most of the kind of European classical literature was saved for us by its transmission to the Middle East, and then slowly it returned again, and when it did, it kind of kick-started the Renaissance. That transmission, which was also a process culture, we change it. Something important happens to these texts, and we're still trying to understand what that means. The books are subliming, they're going up into the air, they're changing their form. And that's a fundamental shift. It's radical, and it produces these differences. And it is ultimately, because literature describes us, a change of our place in the world too. So I'm constantly searching for essentially literatures that reflect that change, that represent a kind of different narrative mode, that the voice of ideas that the physical world and the digital world are separate places, and we talk too often as if they are, when in fact they're deeply intertwined, they're interleaved. Interest in books themselves is, for years I was studying essentially, fairly informally but intently, the people's attitudes to ebooks. This is what really fascinated me when a few years ago, almost a decade ago now, before to this idea. They always seem to focus on the physicality of the book, on the feel of the paper or the weight of the book, and that seems strange because we've always been told that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and yet the physicality was always the thing that people talked about and said that's why they could never accept ebooks. And then, of course, as we know, as soon as commercial e-readers arrive, people adopt them en masse. They're hugely popular, they're growing all the time. So that wasn't the reason. But there had to be a reason for that kind of deeply emotional reaction to the things. Over time, I came to understand that for me, it was kind of embodied in the temporality of the book. That because we don't have our reservations about them, and those reservations might be real, but they weren't just about the feel of the paper or the smell of the book. Those are ridiculous reasons. They were embedded far more deeply in our understanding of what constituted the experience of literature itself. because the two a couple of software scientists called Rob Kitchen and Martin Dodge, where they describe what they call code spaces. This is the archetypal example, right? It's an airport departure lounge. We understand how process through it, but the space itself ceases to function as it's supposed to. It stops being a kind of airport departure lounge and turns into a big shed full of angry people. It fails not only as software, but as architecture itself, because the architecture and the software co-produce one another. They're deeply connected. It is a coded space. And I would make the argument now that the literature is a coded space as well. It's inseparable in many ways from the technology that produces and shapes it, and in turn produces and shapes us. And this has been the case in many ways for kind of so long. This is really important. This is not entirely new. Whether it was the quill or the typewriter or whatever, there's been technological augmentation to the writing and reading processes for as long as there's been writing and reading, because indeed, literature itself is the communication of written words is a technological process. But what happens is the network renders that process more visible. It gives us new ways of understanding and thinking about it if we can understand and think about the network as well. So for some time now, I've been trying to think about how one writes in the style of the network. I undertake projects like this, which is something called the New Aesthetic, which is an ongoing kind of personal research project into the strange disjunctions you find at the joints of the physical and the digital that allow one to kind of interrogate it in a way that the seamlessness of contemporary network technologies obviously don't considered by some to be an art project, which in some ways it is. But it very deliberately avoids the trappings of art projects or art movements of that kind. There's no way this is going to coalesce into a manifesto, for example, because this is not a manifesto-based project. It will not conform to pre-networked ideas of the construction of knowledge. It's attempting to do that in the style of the network itself. I'm also fascinated by the vernacular of the network. The style in which it itself speaks. This is related closely to the sort of spam book stuff we were hearing about earlier. Trying to listen to the style in which the network itself tends to describe itself. This is one of my favorite pieces of spam that kickstarted a whole bunch of interest in this subject. Jerusha from Senegal does not exist in any meaningful way as humans we would understand, and yet behind it there is a voice that kind of appeals, that we try to read something into ourselves, because as always, literature is always interactive, right? It doesn't need whistles and bells and buttons, because the interactivity of literature is when we recreate it for ourselves in our minds. So I do projects where I try to give voices to the machines, collaborating with them, essentially, rather than having a kind of oppositional aspect or attitude to them. This is a project called A Ship Adrift, which used a physical weather station on the building in London to drive an imaginary ship across the world. So when the wind was blowing 5 miles per hour to the east in London, it would drive my little ship 5 miles to the east across the world. And as it went, it knew its own position. So it could then scan the internet for texts about its own location, reading Wikipedia articles, reading posts on social media, reading propositions on hookup sites, in order to create a narrative for itself, and also to attempt to speak that back to us. Texts that were constructed by us and by the network in this vernacular, spam-like style. I'm also interested in the breakdown of authority, which the authority of the text, which the network reveals. Again, this process of something that, perhaps has always been the case, but we haven't been able to see so clearly. We see Dickens here again, of course. Hard Times, a novel about the vast social changes brought on by industrialization. And, of course, the important distinctions between facts and fancy. In this project, I made 50 seemingly identical copies of Dickens's Hard Times. In each of these, in fact, something slightly different happens, small or large changes. The name of a street may differ, the color of a house, or larger changes, a character may live or die, the entire narrative takes place in a different country. I was attempting to replicate the kind of changes you see evidenced in pirated literatures, or indeed in the differences between editions of all kinds, to surface this fact that the text has never been that stable. There's never been, a central perfect edition as we like to conceive of it. It's always been malleable, it's always been changeable, and it's always, had this kind of precarious authority. But because we can now see across the network in these different ways, we can perceive that in ways that we couldn't before. My strong sense is that in trying to understand the differences and changes that network technologies are bringing to literature, something more fundamental than just different formats is required. We kind of need to change our mental models of technology. And we also need to change perhaps our modes of speech. Our language at the moment lacks not only the concepts, but the very person and tense necessary for describing the network. It's what the title of this talk, Network Tense, refers to. The idea that perhaps we need to generate whole new structures of language, which are indeed representational of the structures of the mind, in order to fully describe the world that we find ourselves in. I look for examples of this all around the place. In the sort of dialects of Iaric, the language of Rasta, the use of I and I to describe oneself as part of a greater oneness, wholeness. We must be careful not always, I think, to go too deeply into kind of spiritual dimensions of the potential of the internet. But at the same time, we all know that we feel ourselves to be part of something larger than ourselves when we engage with the network. That is what I and I means. The Rasta scholar E. Cashmore says that I and I is an expression to totalize the concept of oneness. I like that very much. Likewise, we can look at the linguistic structures of someone like or groups like the Pidahan people, of the tribal peoples from the Amazon, who the American linguist Daniel Everett has written about extensively. The Pidahan are fascinating because they're essentially their linguistic structures and therefore their culture lacks concepts of the past and of the future. It lacks the tenses to describe them, and therefore the Pidahan live in a kind of eternal present. Wonderfully, they don't really believe in the truth of second-hand experiences. Only that which is perceived directly has any kind of true value or existence. This was a problem for Everett, who went there as a missionary and rapidly discovered that the Pidahan were not terribly interested in his talk about this guy Jesus because he hadn't met him. But for me, the Pidahan's linguistic structures represent possibly a way to talk about, the state that we find ourselves in now, where we too place our memories, experiences kind of outboard in the network as something that we can constantly access in real time. As we store our memories and experiences remotely, off-board, we too live in a world in which only kind of directed experience is kind of believable and achievable to us. I don't want to appropriate too much from either of these examples of different cultural modes of expression. I would try very hard not to. I use them merely as examples that other modes of expression and thinking are possible and valid explanations of the world. I like to find it in literature as well, and this is my favorite example. William Gibson is massively overquoted in the kind of futurist literatures, but I want to talk about his literary style in particular, not just his ideas. Gibson is the person who gave us some of our first kind of great metaphors for the internet in the form of cyberspace, which is already problematic. We're already realizing that cyberspace, the internet, is not a space. It's certainly not an other. But we have built a huge amount of the network in the image that Gibson gave us. But I like this quote he gave to a reviewer from Amazon, of all places, a couple of years ago, around the publication of his last but one novel, Zero History. The reviewer asked Gibson if he conforms to the kind of stereotype of the writer as someone who kind of withdraws from the world and exists in their own little world. Even someone as connected as Gibson surely must kind of withdraw to concentrate on his work. And Gibson says, no. He used this lovely phrase, I've got Word open on top of Firefox. The writing process layered directly on top of the reading process as a kind of, as part of a continuum, a palimpsest in which these things are organized. And you see that extraordinarily in his work. You see it particularly in his more recent science fiction, which isn't quite science fiction as you'd expect it at all. It takes place in the present day, and strange events occur. Extraordinary things appear in the text, these flying silver surveillance penguins, which feel like the most kind of ultimate science fiction. And then you go online and you discover that these things exist. Gibson just has a kind of far sight across the network that allows him to discover these things before we do. He's not looking forward in time, but out across the network. He's sort of live blogging the present and time-stamping it with references to certain technologies. I've taken to calling this mode of writing, because I'm incapable of not slapping labels on anything, network realism. It's the accessibility of different domains and the ability to write through and across them. It's another form of the vernacular of the network. If anyone's read Thomas Pynchon's new novel, which I highly recommend, Bleeding Edge, I noticed him doing a similar thing, time-stamping, using what I can only believe are deliberate anachronisms for a book that's supposedly set 10 years ago, in order to emphasize the fact that he is trying also to write a book about the network, the internet, and the effect that it's having on us. I think there's something interesting as well that I'm quoting from authors who've been writing for quite some time, people who might be considered elder statesmen. I don't consider there to be any kind of privileging of youth in our ability to conceptualize the network. It's not just a thing for young people. I want to talk right at the end, very briefly, about a silly project, but one I'm very fond of, that may or may not give you some ideas of how I think, at least, about the network, and maybe ways in which we can think about it differently. For some time now, I've been deeply obsessed with various forms of image making in the world, and particularly with architectural visualization. I'm sure you've seen images like this in the world, these kind of 3D renderings of what a beautiful new building is going to look like. I'm obsessed with these not just because of the strange nature of the image making that goes into them, but of where they come from, of the use of software to produce architecture. We've already heard again a bit this morning about how the tools that we use to create books and literatures shape those literatures. Well, they also shape the built environment, the world around us. I know people who can look at new build buildings and tell me what version of AutoCAD was used to design them. There's a kind of software determinism at work here, whereby it's not just like designers and architects building buildings, but software engineers, the people behind them, just as the people who design iBooks or the App Store or any other ones ultimately come to shape our culture in various deep and important ways. As ways of thinking about those forms of determinism, I've focused in on these people, who I call the render ghosts. They're the people who live inside the architectural visualizations. They're also the people who live inside the near future. They're us, just in the future, just ahead, but a future, of course, that never quite arrives, because no one actually lives in the future. But they are, for me, an interesting way of talking about and conceptualizing these liminal spaces that exist kind of just ahead of us in the network. I've been trying to track them down for some time. I discovered that there was a couple of sets of these people, about 200 of them, who've been available on the internet for about a decade and have been pirated endlessly, so they're the same people used by architects all over the world. You can buy these or just download and pirate and torrent sets of actual people, high-res images you can insert into your visualizations. Here's a couple of them, for example, on the High Line in New York. I've seen these same people reproduced in London, in Sydney, in San Francisco. They've traveled the world like we travel the network through these kind of digital spheres. And I wanted to ask them what that felt like, so I've been trying to find them. I discovered a while back that the company that produced this particular set was based in Albuquerque. So I went there last week and started looking for them there too. I subsequently discovered that actually the company had moved to Albuquerque after these images were taken, so I still don't know where these people come from, though they live somewhere, I'm pretty sure, in the United States. Instead, while I was there, I became deeply interested in the state history of New Mexico and its involvement with the atomic program, and in turn of the connections between the atomic program and the internet. We have the internet in large part because of the Manhattan Project and everything that followed it. We developed digital computers in order to calculate hydrogen bomb reactions. And we developed the internet itself, a DARPA-led project, in order to distribute computing to survive a nuclear war. These are connected projects. So in order to understand that, I made life-size versions of the render ghosts. And I took them on a road trip to Los Alamos as an attempt to reunite these differing aspects of the network. I'm still piecing aspects of this project together. It was very much created on the hoof. But this is the one thing that I thought about when I did that, which is that the internet is like history, and history is like the internet. You can go right to the heart of it. You can visit data centers and the locations of servers, or you can go to places like Los Alamos, these crucial, important centers of where these things occurred. But that's not where it is, right? It's diffuse, it's everywhere. It's the structure and not the event. All this time, when I say we've been looking for new mental models or frameworks to understand the internet, that we need new languages, perhaps it's the internet that's a framework to describe everything. Not the first, not the last, but maybe the best we've made so far. A structure that resembles and replicates and shapes history, memory, and consciousness. It's kind of, we're mapping ourselves. It's a tool that we've built to explain ourselves to ourselves. I've been looking for a way to explain the internet, but the internet might be the explanation. When I try to think, what is the internet for? Why have we made it? One of the expressions I use, I call it an unconsciously generated tool for unconscious generation. We're not using it for what we thought we would, and we're making new stuff with it, this strange, formless tool. It's a kind of hyper-McLuhanism. We shape our tools, they shape us, but then we shape them again, and that loop gets ever, ever tighter. Because it seems like our tools increasingly resemble us. If literature is the best expression we have for explaining ourselves to ourselves, then the technologies that have built up around it are also part of that explanation as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. So I've allowed James to eat our Q&A because I thought, first of all, the talk was amazing, and also I had to borrow him from the same talk he gave yesterday at a Berkeley conference, and I really sort of invade upon him to come and give the talk today. So I hope if you have questions of our speakers from this preceding panel, you can pigeonhole them during our break. But we are now going to be on break until 12, is that right? And yes, and so we'll have one more short panel, and then after that panel we'll have lunch. So hang in there, grab some sugar or other carbohydrates, and we'll reconvene shortly. Thank you.